Thanks, Rob, and I'm happy to see so many of you at this annual conference, the Max Havelaar lecture. I feel a bit intimidated being told to talk about science, because I've never really thought of myself as being fully a scientist. You see, in high school, I specialized in maths, physics, and chemistry when I thought I'd become a scientist. But then I went and studied economics instead, and so no more science after that. And now I'm in the field of management science, so to speak. So, I don't have very grandiose views for our subject. And let me start by saying that management science is in a unique position among other academic subjects. Now, why is that? Because we are the one subject where we have the problem of being separate from the subject that we study. We study managers and companies, and we're outside. So let's make some comparisons. First of all, compared with physics or engineering, that's very obvious. So an academic who is studying physics or engineering is looking at at one set of phenomena. There are no other physicists out there who are practicing physicists who are different from the ones in the universities. The engineering academics who are studying the structural factors of bridges are looking at the same physical phenomena as the engineers who are out there building the bridges. And in fact, the academic engineer can walk onto the bridge and talk really on the same terms as the engineer who's building the bridge. If we get a bit closer to our subject, say to lawyers, what's the difference from lawyers? Well, lawyers, the law is embodied in books, regulations, statutes, the reports of trials, so that the legal cases that academic lawyers study is really the same as are argued in the courtroom. And indeed, some academic lawyers do go into the courtroom themselves. What about economics? Well, economics is studying the economy, but there is no other body that they have to relate to. The other people they relate to are economists. So we're in the unique position that we have this other group, companies, managers, whom we're studying from the outside. So that's both good and bad from our point of view as management scientists. It's good in the sense that we sort of create some independence. So we have the practitioners on the one side, and then we have the academics outside studying them and perhaps to some extent keeping them honest or giving them good advice from the outside. So we have these two. But what's bad from our point of view is that it's then hard for us to stay relevant because we are not running companies. We are not in the boardrooms. We're not in there with the managers. And it is too easy for us to focus on our own academic peers as the audience. So we have the unique problem of the two audiences, which is a unique challenge for management schools, as Rob pointed out. This means that we have to engage harder, particularly when it comes to corporate social responsibility and sustainability, because these are topics themselves which are sort of a four-way engagement, I would say, of companies, governments, NGOs, and academia. So, those of you in sustainability and CSR also know the problem of engagement because you're trying to, say, get companies to change their behavior and you are, again, acting on them from the outside. So what's the potential contribution of business schools in the whole issue of sustainability, corporate social responsibility? Well, it comes from the increasingly recognized fact that companies have the most power to achieve not just business, but non-business objectives. Rob identified over 100 types of power in companies. Now, why do I say this? Because where else, except in companies, is there such a concentration of money, talent, and systems? I truly believe that the modern corporation is the most effective organization ever created by humanity. Now, this is a pretty broad assertion. Other people might say, well, how about the Catholic Church? How about the army of Alexander the Great? Well, my view is that those, of course, are extremely effective, efficient organizations, but they have a relatively narrow mission. Corporations have very broad missions and have to do all kinds of different things and are indeed much more flexible. By the way, if you don't mind me pursuing a little bit this analogy of the Catholic Church, since I was brought up as a Catholic, sometimes, Catholic Church has been held up as an example of organization. They say, why do you need more than 3 levels of organization? After all, the Catholic Church is highly effective with only 3 levels of organization. Well, if you use business terminology, the reason why the Catholic Church only needs 3 levels of organization is that their business model is distributed service delivery. And the delivery node is the single priest who's been trained to operate on his own. I can't say yet his or her own. And indeed, if you think about it, a priest can operate quite successfully in a community, say in Africa, completely cut off from the rest of the world. A manager cannot do that. A manager in a modern corporation is operating in a network, typically a global network of communication. So it's just, a different kind of function. And this, by the way, is the kind of thing that we teach in our school here, the notion of contingency organizational design. It depends on, the mission and the kinds of things that you're trying to do. So let's not, when we're looking at sustainability, let's not ignore or overly criticize companies, but seek to harness their power. And we're already starting to see this, say, in the companies that are working on the bottom of the pyramid, developing products to serve the poorest people in the world. And like thinking about, I think the latest example, the best example I've come across is the, say we know well the flashlight, the torch that is hand cranked without needing battery power. Or actually, I think the best new example is the water filter that requires no electricity, right? And is really transforming the ability to have safe water in many places. Now, but what do we have to think about in terms of the power that businesses have? Because let me be the first to say that not all companies have good intentions. Indeed, some do seek to exploit customers, employees, and environments. But I'd like to stress also that those with bad intentions tend not to be large Western multinational companies. Unfortunately, sometimes it's the suppliers to the large Western multinational companies who may have the bad intentions, who exploit their employees or exploit animals and so on. But of course, a large Western multinationals get the most attention because they're prominent and because they're the most powerful, and indeed they're the most susceptible to pressure from NGOs and the media. So that's the intention issue. But even with the good intentions at the top, many companies do bad things. Because companies are so good at motivating their employees, they can also motivate them to do the wrong things, to skimp on safety so that you end up with an oil spill. Now, of course, BP didn't say to the employees, we want you to skimp on safety. What they might have said was, we want you to maximize profits in this period and not spend too much on maintenance, etc. By the way, I'm happy to find, being British, that it turns out that the fault really came from the American part of the company that was merged into British Petroleum. So in the end, President Obama was blaming the wrong part of BP. It was the Amoco-American Texan culture that was not pro-safety. I learned this just about 3 days ago, so I'm happy to feed it into this speech. Or, lend money for mortgages with little chance of repayment. Why did that happen? Of course, the people at the top of the company didn't say, we want you to lend mortgages that nobody can repay, but they made the mistake of putting in incentive systems that rewarded the bank managers for the volume of loans they originated and not for the end result 5, 10 years down the road. And by the way, I cannot resist using this opportunity to say that it is not business schools that were at fault in the crisis, or MBAs or business graduates. It's the fault of the PhD economists in 2 ways. One, PhD economists, PhD finance, PhD statisticians created the instruments, the derivatives that blew up. Their models didn't work. And of course, the MBAs who ran the companies, you might blame them for doing this. Of course, the MBAs aren't as smart as the PhDs. So if the PhDs told them those products work, they leave them. Secondly, the other kind of PhD economists to blame are the macroeconomists who deregulated the banks, who broke down the Glass-Steagall Act, the separation of commercial lending and investment banking. So really, the people who've been trying to do the reforms have been looking at the wrong kind of schools. Let's reform the schools of economics, not the schools of management. So that's my little... So companies do need to be regulated, and they do need to be under pressure from NGOs. But the issue is to achieve the right balance. So for NGOs in particular, this means engaging with companies and not demonizing them. There is, of course, a temptation for NGOs to exercise their power, which is often the power of the protest and the power of media and launching also social media campaigns. You know, this company is, just last week I was reading about an American company that Greenpeace launched a campaign against on the basis that this company's suppliers were exploiting pigs that, you know, made the leather that went into some of their clothes, rather than actually looking at the processes the company already had in place for the safe and ethical treatment of the animals. So engage with them and don't just overuse your own power. Then a very interesting research issue is whether stakeholders, such as NGOs, should have a role in corporate governance. And here it's interesting to contrast the Anglo-American system and the continental European system. And one of the difficulties in the Anglo-American system, where the shareholder is supposed to be paramount, is actually the issue of fiduciary duty. You put an NGO on the board in an Anglo-American style system, and you know, they may have a fiduciary duty to maximize the interests of the shareholders and could even be sued if they're doing things that are not directly promoting the interests of shareholders. Perhaps it's better for an NGO to be on an advisory board instead. But this is a very interesting and fruitful area of research that Rob and his colleagues are looking at. Sort of the jury is definitely out on this issue. Another question that Rob Van Tulder raised in his paper, rather cheekily I thought, was whether business schools themselves can be organized without power, and if not, how power can be distributed evenly and productively. I mean, I'm a bit biased as a dean, because my view is that without formal power, academia will be taken over by the tyranny of demagogues, the Robespierres of academia. And for the youngsters among you, perhaps, you know, Robespierre was the French revolutionary who started the terror. And believe me, some professors are incipient Robespierres. So I do believe in a system of countervailing power. When I arrived at RSM, I found that we have very powerful department chairs, almost in the German model of really controlling the departments. So I've used the power of my dean's office to offset that and to make life fairer for individual faculty members. So I've actually dealt with this power issue myself. Then another question Rob raised for me was, can a publish or perish organization of science contribute to the production of societally relevant knowledge? Again, this is a particularly difficult issue for management science. The peer review process means that we do run the danger of losing touch with our subjects of study, companies and society. So again, the solution is more engagement and support from companies and NGOs with strings attached. With strings attached. Yes, this is heresy for a dean to say this, but I want financial supporters from business and NGOs to attach strings to the chairs and research centers that they sponsor, because strings that tie us back to the subjects of interest to the sponsors. That keeps us more relevant, and that is the model that I've adopted at RSM for those who have been generous enough to sponsor our research. Such an approach does not violate academic freedom. Academic freedom does not mean that a professor can do research on whatever he or she likes. For example, at RSM, a faculty member cannot conduct research on Chinese calligraphy unless there is a very good link to management, which I cannot imagine. Academic freedom does mean that the faculty member can teach or publish any conclusion of their research, even if it's detrimental to the interests of the sponsor. So people often confuse about this issue of academic freedom. It's an important point. It's not the freedom to do what you like, such as, you know, I'm going to study the beach at Copacabana, even though I'm a professor of management. So, in closing, I think that RSM is a school that very much believes in contributing to the future of our world. Indeed, so much so that we've adopted the slogan, the business school that thinks and lives in the future. Thank you very much.